Violent protest, a contentious issue in the contemporary socio-political climate of our country. Is it ever justified? Is it even effective in creating positive change?
I think there are pros and cons. I think it's very complex.
Sometimes it's necessary.
I mean, it's one thing to burn down a Target. It's another thing to burn down someone's house.
Think of the French Revolution. You think they could have, achieved the French Revolution without any violence?
Violent protests in and of themselves are weaponized against the protesters to undermine their message. Violence can only beget violence.
Let's examine two instances of violent protest, from Shays Rebellion in 1787 to the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. Shays Rebellion was an instance of violent protest in early American history. Boston farmers, many of whom fought in the Revolutionary War, were unable to pay their debts and began being arrested in the 1780s. Protest of this violation of their liberty began peacefully, but escalating frustrations at being ignored by the Massachusetts government, as well as instances such as a brutal assault of a rebel farmer and his family by a militia, resulted in armed conflict between the insurgents and the governor's privately funded militia trying to shut them down. In the final clash, 20 farmers were wounded and 4 died. On December 6, 1787, 2 men were hanged for robbery and treason. The farmers' demands were met at long last in the summer of 1787, when Governor Hancock placed a moratorium on debts and cut taxes, easing the economic burden on the farmers.
I think historically, violent protest has worked.
The Black Lives Matter movement has been predominantly peaceful since its establishment in 2013.
I didn't even hear about it until 2020.
Countless acts of police violence against people of color, specifically black men, with no justice served by the state, acted as fans to the flame of escalating tensions that culminated in the summer of 2020.
There's a huge list of names.
People were outraged, rightfully so. It was really brutal.
The murder of George Floyd by Officer Derek Chauvin in 2020 saw a turn toward violent protests in addition to peaceful rallies, marches, and community outreach.
I thought that they were justified but flawed in that there was violence.
The media coverage on that was based around the riots and people looting stores and burning stuff, and that totally undermined the legitimacy of the cause.
A lot of what I knew about it before then came from the news, and that has a sort of skewed view on it.
Any right-wing media would constantly show burning buildings and violence and beatings and bricks being thrown. And if you switch the channel, you'd see peaceful protests.
Most of these people, they'd set up tents, giving out water, medical supplies, and caring for each other. The only real places that were dangerous was where the police were.
Okay. Have you heard of Philando Castile?
No.
Have you heard of Philando Castile?
It sounds familiar, but
Have you heard of Philando Castile?
I haven't.
Have you heard of Philando Castile?
No. Should I?
So this was a man who was murdered a few years prior to George Floyd. He's a black man in Minnesota as well. He was killed by the police. And there's also a video of it. He was killed. He was shot with his girlfriend in the car and his girlfriend's baby in the backseat.
That's crazy that I haven't heard of that.
Why do you think you've heard of George Floyd and know so much about his case when Philando Castile's hasn't been brought to your attention as intensely?
I feel like it wasn't until the George Floyd protests and everything that came out of that people sort of woke up to just this is terrible and this is happening way too often.
Part of me doesn't want to admit or say that it was because peaceful protests are less effective, even though I know that they are.
While many criticized the movements for their violence and destruction of property, there was an inarguable result from the attention that the protests drew to the cause. Many changes were made in local legislation, including limitations and bans of chokeholds and diaphragm compression by police in several states. The Eric Garner Anti-Chokehold Act was passed in New York in June of 2020, 6 years after Garner was killed by police.
What sparked it was media outrage and public outrage at the death of an innocent person.
In the examination of the conditions surrounding both Shays Rebellion in 1787 and the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, it can be concluded that our country's systems of justice are created and preserved to protect the interests of those in power, and this transcends racial barriers. Referring to the insurgent farmers, wealthy conservative Chief Justice William Whiting said, "Whenever any encroachments are making either upon the liberties or properties of the people, if redress cannot be had without, it is virtue in them to disturb the government. The people must be free to exercise their right to protest unjust conditions imposed upon them by the state, to whatever degree necessary for creating substantial change."